Craving fresh, made-from-scratch Mexican food that actually tastes homemade? Cafe Rio's got you covered. Every tortilla is hand-rolled, every sauce is slow-simmered, and every bite is bursting with bold flavor. Hungry yet? Don't wait. Order now at CafeRio.com. Build your burrito, salad, or tacos exactly how you like them, and we'll have it ready hot, fresh, and fast. Whether it's lunch on the go, dinner with friends, or a full-on fiesta at home, Cafe Rio always brings the flavor and the fun. So what are you waiting for? We've got you covered. Savor the flavor and order now at CafeRio.com.
You're listening to the Utah Checkdown podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you for another week. It's a big week. It's rivalry week. It's time to talk BYU Utah. We recapped the game last week, Utah's win over Arizona State, but now we get a chance to be able to preview the biggest game. Maybe some people don't think it's the biggest game, but it's a big game nonetheless, and it's bragging rights, it's everything, and, this game has the real potential to kind of showcase what Utah's made of. And I said that last week to some extent with Arizona State, and I truly believed it. But each week it continues to be that way, right? It's a what have you done for me lately type mentality. And, Utah has to continue that. I don't want to say they can't lose a game here on out, but at the same time, you have to prove yourself and you have to continue to find ways to get better. And what worked a few weeks ago may not work now. And it's always about changing and the evolution of how that goes. So, it's going to be an entertaining game. Both of these programs clearly want the win. It's the first ranked upon. Wow, we're really getting off the rails early. Ranked versus ranked since 2009. There we go. We're going to get on the rails back. And so, you've got two teams that are clearly looking to be able to establish themselves in the Big 12 and really kind of jumpstart the second half of the season. For BYU, they go into their toughest part of their schedule. Utah, they're kind of in the middle of it where you still got a couple tough games, but this becomes one of the bigger games, especially with how well BYU has performed and having this be the rivalry. So we'll preview all that and kind of jump into that, and then we'll also have a special guest to talk about the Cougars and kind of get their take on how this game is operating. So we'll jump into that. But first, let me tell you about our partners, Cafe Rio. Craving fresh, made-from-scratch Mexican food that's actually tastes homemade? Cafe Rio's got you covered. Every tortilla is hand-rolled, every sauce is slow-simmered, and every bite is bursting with bold flavor. Hungry yet? Don't wait. Order now at CafeRio.com. Build your burrito, salad, or tacos exactly how you like them, and we'll have them ready, hot, fresh, and fast. We've got you covered. Savor the flavor and order now at CafeRio.com. That actually does make me hungry. It is lunchtime as I'm recording this podcast, so I'm getting a little hungry. Probably have to go get that Cafe Rio, get some good Mexican food in me. So we're gonna jump right into this preview. Coming into this game, this is one of those games that is always close, right? The last 11 games. It's been 8. Okay, let me rephrase this. 8 of the last 11 games have been by one score, and 11 of the last 15 have been that way. So this is a game that is always tight. That's not to say that one team can't break away or that there's not a big performance every once in a while, but by and large, that's more of the anomaly than it is the usual, right? These are tight games. It's pretty crazy that 3 of those 8 games in that 11-year span, so dating back to when Utah joined the Pac-12, that's been 1-point games. So this isn't uncommon to have a 1-point win. Clearly last year was that way for BYU. Utah looked like they were on their way to winning that game in a year that they had no business doing so. And suddenly, BYU marches down the field. We don't need to get back into those theatrics. And they come away with a 1-point win. So BYU currently on a 2-game win streak over Utah after Utah had gone 9 straight. And so, there's a bit of a little banter there going back and forth. Is this BYU's era where they go on the run, or does Utah stop this and kind of put things back on track in their views? So we'll see, right? Like, this is one of those games that is going to be really entertaining. You're down at LaVell Edwards Stadium where those BYU fans are going to be raucous and ready to go. The student section is going to fill that area up. It's a night environment on, Fox. And so it's going to be on full display for the country to be able to see the passion and the hatred that these two teams have for each other and the entertainment that it can provide. So I'm looking forward to it. It's always a fun environment to be able to have these kinds of games for the rivalry specifically. These are the games that you want, right? In years past, when Utah was in the Pac-12 and BYU was in independence, this game didn't have that same weight. There wasn't anything on the line. It was more just kind of like a nuisance for Utah from their perspective of, now we have to play this game in the middle of a Pac-12 schedule or at the end of the Pac-12 schedule, whatever that may be. But it really didn't have any value other than just this emotional game. Now there's something on the line, right? And especially with both of these teams ranked and both of these teams in the hunt for a Big 12 title, it comes back to having something entertaining and of value there. And I know some people get frustrated that it's in October instead of, late November. I do think that this is a great opportunity to showcase the rivalry to the country. You get it at a prime time spot. Clearly there was some fireworks last year to kind of give people a taste of what that is. Now you get an opportunity to do that with two ranked teams. All of those things matter, right? You're trying to market your team, whether that's BYU, whether that's Utah. You're trying to market your team, and these things are interesting to be able to have. So, great opportunity to look at all these things. So, coming into this game, looking at the betting lines, it's held pretty firmly around 2.5 to 3.5 for Utah. Just a slight edge, quite honestly, and that's about where you would expect there. The over-under here is 49.5. Based on how these two teams have scored, the over could be hit pretty easily on that. But I would say based on the last few years of this, that becomes a challenge. You've got two solid defenses who are, very impactful and, near the top of the country in many statistical categories to be able to showcase that they can stop them. So really, really fascinated to see how this comes together. So jumping into this first, let's look at the injury report. So last night, the first availability report was put out. Utah's is pretty much unchanged from where it's been at. The guys that have been held out are out. There isn't any new additions to that. Utah comes into this game relatively healthy. Considering the last couple of years, this is probably the most healthy that they've been. They've got their impact players available. They're ready to go. And, that bodes well for a Utah team that's really been struggling to kind of have their guys fully available. And so good opportunity for Utah from that perspective. On the BYU side, a key player is out, and that's Raider Demooney. He's the starting strong safety for the Cougars. He's an impactful player, right? Like, he's a guy that is going to help that secondary a ton. And him being out is not a great sign for the Cougars. However, they do have some players that have been able to fit in there. That's Tanner Wall, Falawata Satawala, who's been able to be in there and be impactful. So you do have some players that can kind of step in there, but curious to see, if Utah tests the passing game and kind of what that means. Will you feel Demooney's impact on, not being there? Will that impact the game? It remains to be seen. The Cougars, though, they do get a great opportunity back with having Isaiah Glasker and Jack Kelly in that room. Now, Glasker, he played through injury and was fine for the Arizona game last week. Whether he's 100% healthy, doubtful. No player really is at this point. But the real concern was for Jack Kelly, who was held out last week. He did something to his shoulder. There's never really been any specificity to what actually took place against, what was it, West Virginia? Am I blanking? Am I missing my games right? I don't remember. But either way, a couple weeks ago, he was injured. And, it was always kind of trending to Kelly probably playing for this game. This game obviously means a ton. I don't think BYU is necessarily putting him in harm's way because they're getting him back too early, but it's hard to know, right? It's always one of those situations where he's going to play. And so I think as long as BYU feels like he's ready to go, he's going to be in there. And that was reflected in the availability report last night. So that's a great opportunity for BYU to have their two starting linebackers who are quite honestly just the heartbeat of that defense. There's a lot of good players on that defense, but those two players specifically are kind of what makes it work. Without one or both of them, it becomes much more difficult to have the success that BYU's had on defense. That's not to say that other guys can't step up, clearly, but those two, you want to go into this game with those two. And so we'll see them. How healthy they are, remains to be seen. But like I said, every player in the country is experiencing some sort of injury to some level or degree. So, that's the nature of it. You're going to go out there and you're ball out and try to beat your rival. So that's how it's going to happen. So, coming into this game, there was a lot of offseason noise about Carson Ryan, tight end from Utah, and Keanu Tenavasa, defensive tackle that transferred to BYU. Look, I'm not here to relitigate any of that stuff. We've gone over a bunch of that over the last few months, and it is what it is. And I think that's just the nature of college football and moving different directions. Clearly, there's been BYU players that haven't felt like they've wanted to play there anymore and have come to Utah, and you're seeing some of them excelling. John Henry Daly is the biggest name right there that I would say is really having a breakout year and has been a great asset for Utah to be able to have him transferring from BYU. Obviously, Logan Fano, big transfer that he's been able to have. There's other players, right? I don't need to list all of them, but there's just a lot of interchange between these two programs. But I would say Carson Ryan has been a breath of fresh air for BYU and what he's able to provide. I think this is what Utah expected to have from Ryan when he transferred from UCLA to Utah last year. Unfortunately, Utah was just in a situation where it just didn't work, right? We've spent a lot of time talking about the offense and the deficiencies that they had, and it just wasn't a great situation. Utah has since changed that, obviously, and they've become one of the most efficient and effective offenses in the country, but it was just not a year that worked for Carson Ryan. And so, had you had him in this offense, he would have excelled, right? And I think you're seeing that with BYU. He's excelling because of the talent that he is, right? He's a great pass blocker. He's great on the line to be able to provide that protection, but he's also been great in the receiving game. And, that's not a surprise to Utah. This isn't like somehow they didn't know how to unlock his potential. It was just they couldn't get him the ball, nor could they get anybody the ball. We've gone over that. You get that. Keanu Tenavasa, he's been a little bit more of a charged figure going to BYU with BYU and Utah fans. He's clearly got an impact on that BYU defense, right? Like, he's a run stopper. He gets in there. He does it. But there's a lot of fans frustrated with it. And I don't know that it's fully merited, simply because, you don't generally focus on a defensive tackle. Now, he's had a few kind of boneheaded plays the last couple weeks where it's been a late hit or it's been a targeting penalty that's really gotten people to understand who he is. But, I don't know that this is one of those situations that you have to pay attention too much to the defensive tackle, okay? So it is what it is. We bring it up simply because these were the biggest names. Clearly, there was a lot of offseason drama with that, and, time has passed, and I think Utah feels very comfortable with what they've got. And so there's no real hard feelings there. But with that said, I would not at all be surprised if Utah comes after him, right? I think if you've gone over there and made such a loud noise and really painted yourself in a box of kind of putting yourself in the opposition, Utah's going to come after that, and they're going to try to do whatever they can to expose him. Now, whether that happens or not remains to be seen, but at the same time, I don't think Utah's going into this game fully just saying, okay, we got to go after Keanu. Like, I don't think that's a smart strategy. Utah's going to go into this game with their basic strategy, understanding what they need to do, but if you can also beat up the guy that left you and said all these different things about Utah, that's a natural part of it. So I definitely think that you're going to have an offensive line that is going to be hungry to go after him and prove that they can take him out and remove him from the game. But at the same time, Utah has to stick to its game plan, right? Like, you can't get too emotional into this and say, you were part of us and you're not anymore. Like, Kyle Whittingham says it all the time. You have to focus on the players that you have. And that's true, right? Like, you can't focus on the guys that leave. It's the same as any business that's in there. You've got to be able to focus on who you have. And if you're always looking over your shoulder or looking at what you could have had or anything, it doesn't really impact you, or it impacts you, but in a way that doesn't help you. So, don't expect that. So look at some of these advanced stats. This has been kind of what I've been doing lately to look at this, and it's been really solid to kind of focus on how this works. So we're going to kind of look a little bit at how these two teams operate, and if you look at the statistics, they're pretty similar. It's not perfect, right? Like, it's not a one-to-one comparison, but there is a lot of similarities in these two teams, especially when you just look at the standard statistics. When you look at the advanced statistics, there's a lot of, there's a little bit more nuance there, and it changes a little bit, and Utah looks like more of a complete team. BYU is still complete-ish, but the defense definitely weighs more heavy than the offense. So, interesting to kind of see this battle and how it'll unfold. Clearly, Utah is in a much better place than they have been, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to win this game. The win probability right now is around 60% for Utah. The odds makers are clearly in Utah's side. The stats are generally pointing to Utah, but that doesn't mean anything in these games, right? Last year, BYU, just based on who they were, was clearly a much better team, and Utah held them, and was able to do what they needed to essentially win that game before they didn't. So, a lot to deal with in this game, a lot to look at. And so just looking at some of the interesting things here. So kind of jumping off of that predicted points added. So this is once again looking at how much value you add to your team based on what is expected where you're at on the field. Both of these teams are basically locked up. One ranks 20th, that's Utah, and BYU ranks 25th. So there's not going to be a lot of an edge there. Even when you look at the defensive side of the ball, BYU ranks 11th and Utah ranks 13th, excuse me. So it's pretty well locked there in terms of points added and kind of what these two teams can do. So, it's pretty even-keeled there. From there, it separates a bit, but it's still pretty marginal. There's not a lot of separation there. Looking at Utah in their success rate, so once again, picking up the yardage that you need on a specific down, half the yardage, whatever that may be. Utah is their success rate is 52.2%, so 9th in the country, whereas BYU's offense is a little bit lower at 47.9 for 29th in the country, but that's still really solid. Both teams are essentially getting what they want in that regard. Now, when you look on the defensive side of the ball, Utah, though, is allowing teams only 34.5%. That ranks 11th in the country, whereas BYU is allowing 37%, which is 24th in the country. So still similar. This is an edge a little bit for Utah on their defensive side of the ball. So on the success rate side, Utah's offense and defense has been better than BYU. And you can say, you can look at strength of schedule, and some people are going to look at that and say, oh, it's, clearly been better for Utah. Their strength of schedule has been so much better. The reality is both of these teams at this point are about even. Utah's obviously played Texas Tech, and they've had maybe a few tougher competitions, Arizona State probably being factored in there. But both of these teams have had tough competition relative to what's out there. That it can be definitely tougher. BYU is going to have a much tougher schedule later in the season. And so, they're not always a one-to-one comparison, but at the same time, both of these teams are pretty similar. In terms of explosiveness, and, we've talked about this many, many times, Utah is just not an explosive team. They're much more methodical in slow, not even slow, but just getting the yardage that they need to when they need to, right? Like if they need to go for a bigger play, they've generally been able to try that and have mostly success with that. But for the most part, this is a team that that hasn't needed to be explosive. And, if you look at this as a metric, a lot of people will look at this and say, that's a big indicator of how a team operates. It is, but at the same time, it doesn't have to be a factor so long as the team is executing to what their game plan is. Clearly, Utah's been okay. They're averaging 39.5 points per game. This is not something where Utah's just squeaking by and the numbers are lying. It's more Utah's just really embracing their, I wouldn't even call it a lack of explosiveness, but they're embracing what they do best. And as long as that continues to work, Utah's found success. And everybody can point to that Texas Tech game, and they're not wrong, but at the same time, it's not a full picture there either, because Utah was able to limit what Texas Tech was able to do on defense for most of the night. It's just Utah's offense couldn't do it. And it was because of the Texas Tech defense, but it was also because you had a hobbled Devin Dampier. Things didn't factor in. So all of these numbers throw in this factor, the schedules and all that kind of stuff. And Utah still, their explosiveness just hasn't been there. They're one of the worst in the country in explosiveness, but at the same time, that doesn't pre-tell how this offense can move the ball, if that makes sense. Now, with that said, BYU's explosiveness isn't a ton better. It's better, but it's not a ton better. They rank 71st in the country, so average, roughly. They're okay, but it's not been anything earth-shattering. The biggest difference here comes on the defensive side of the ball. BYU's defense has been much more equipped to, I wouldn't even call it equipped, because I don't think that's a fair statement. They've been better to this point in limiting explosive plays. Now, this is where some people will say it's been different, with the strength of schedule, and you'll probably get some agreement there. But they ranked 8th in the country in limiting explosive plays, whereas Utah ranks 99th. So they've given up a little bit more, but it's been a little bit different knowing that they also have a game with Texas Tech on there. If you were to strip that game out of there, which you can't because it factors into it, but if you strip that out of there, that number is going to be far different for Utah. BYU still has the advantage on the defense, but that's just limiting explosive plays. Now, when we go to the line yardage, this is, once again, how the offensive line produces yards. Utah's averaging 3.64 line yards. That's 6th in the country. That's pretty dang good. BYU is averaging 3.26, which is 26. So, once again, fairly similar, top 25-ish for that. Defensively, looking at that, Utah allows or gives up only 2.34 yards, which is 12th in the country, and BYU gives up 2.6 yards, so 31st. So that may not sound like a ton, but those things are actually a big number, right? Like, those types of things matter, where even though it's like 3.64 yards, we're not measuring yardage that way, but it's just talking about the edge that you're kind of getting. If you're continually getting that edge, that could mean an extra yard to your opponent. If you can continue to stretch the field that way, that's a big deal. So clearly, Utah's offensive line has been able to do well, but that's not to say that BYU's offensive line hasn't been able to do well either. Stuff rate. Utah's been pretty great at not allowing teams to stuff them, keep them behind the line of scrimmage. Essentially, part of that is Devin Dampier. Part of that is just that offensive line moving the line, right? Like, when you get those 3.64 yards essentially per carry, that's averaged, right? But per carry, you're not going to be behind the line of scrimmage that often. And so it's just kind of more goes to the effect of how well that offensive line is jiving and moving the ball, or moving the line so that you can move the ball. That helps. Utah ranks 8th there. BYU, they're allowing a little bit more at 14.6%, but it's not a ton. LJ Martin is going to get a lot of credit for that, especially for BYU. He's been a phenomenal runner for them. He's a guy that Utah is going to have to focus on tremendously to be able to ensure that, he doesn't get these gashes, these plays that really impact him and do that. If Utah can get behind the line of scrimmage and stop him, that's going to be a huge opportunity for them. Defensively, Utah is been much better there. They have a much more aggressive. I wouldn't even call it more aggressive, because BYU is aggressive, but I think their pass rushers have been more. They're better, simply. And so Utah's been able to stuff teams at 23.4%, which is 19th. BYU is a lower 58% or 58th in the country at 20.5%. I'm sorry, that was really rough. So 20.5% for 58th in the country. So this is kind of where you're starting to see a little bit more of that separation on the defensive side of the ball. Utah's able to create a little bit more behind the line of scrimmage and get those stops that they've needed to. Lastly, looking at havoc plays, Utah hasn't really allowed many havoc plays. So these are the sacks, the forced fumbles, the tackles for loss, that kind of stuff. Utah ranks third in the country at allowing only 8.6% of that. So pretty high in terms of not allowing that. BYU's offense allows 12.6. So there's been a little bit more allowed there at 28th in the country, but not a ton still. That offensive line is protecting pretty well. When you look at the defense, though, BYU has been much better at creating havoc plays, which is kind of funny considering the stuff rate. Utah's been able to stuff really well, but they're not creating the havoc plays in terms of turnovers or big tackles for losses or sacks relative to kind of what BYU's done. So BYU's defense is at 17%, which is 48th in the country, and Utah's at 23.4%, which is 60th in the country. So, it's interesting kind of how those go. Those numbers aren't right. I need to fix that. Clearly, Utah's defense giving up 23.4 is better than BYU 17. So sorry about that. They have created more havoc. Okay, I was like, that doesn't really make sense based on the stuff rate. So my numbers were off on that one. So Utah has been better there and been able to do that. So all in all, like, this is two teams that are pretty solid. They're pretty effective in what they do. This game is really going to come down to the turnover battle. It's going to come down to trench play. I know that a lot of people will look at trench play as kind of the cowardly way of saying this is a game won. But when you're talking about a BYU-Utah game where both of these programs put a ton of emphasis on the lines, this does matter, right? Like, this is where if you can establish kind of your dominance in the trenches, that's going to go a long ways. That doesn't mean that it's going to predict everything, right? It's not going to predict that a team can move the ball or anything. It just generally means that you've had the ability to kind of do what you need to. There's other factors on that defense or the offense that have to work, but at the same time, this is kind of where it is, and this is where you kind of establish your aggressiveness and the tone of the game of how you want to play. You can see the difference when, for example, Utah went into that UCLA game. You can even say the Arizona State game because it's very, very similar. They came in aggressive and they won the line of scrimmage. They were, they set the tone there, and that translated a ton into how the offense was able to produce, right? And it was clear that there was no stopping Utah. They knew what they wanted. There was this, drive and focus. Whereas you look at a game, let's say like a Cal Poly or Wyoming, where that attention to detail or the aggressiveness wasn't the same. It wasn't as sharp. It's not that you didn't believe that Utah would win or that they could move the ball. It just didn't have that same aggressiveness. There was times where you felt like Wyoming, for example, was a much more aggressive team, that they had the momentum on their side. Maybe momentum is a better description of that. But this is kind of how you set that, right? And whichever team can set that tone in the lines, generally speaking, is going to be able to have a better time because it's just you're pushing that. You're creating your own momentum. And so I think that's going to be a big factor. BYU, they've benefited from the turnover margin the last couple of years, which has greatly helped them win the games. That's where Utah has to be crisp, right? Like, you can't allow BYU to get extra possessions, especially if the statistics and the games are close. You can't give the opponent that edge. It applies the same with penalties. If you continue to get penalized more than your opponent, it's not going to go well. So pretty typical, keys to the game, so to speak, for this type of game. But that's really what it comes down to in this. Could one of these teams separate and beat the other by a large margin? I would be doubtful of that. I would say Utah's offense is a little bit more complete, so that would be more of the expectation that it could happen. But this is a one possession game essentially, and you're going to see a lot of closeness to that, barring some team just really just establishing themselves and taking it to them, right? If one of these teams can jump out with a 14-0 lead, that completely changes the game, right? That's not to say that this still couldn't be a one possession game near the end, but that changes how this works. So really fascinated to see how this goes. A lot of talented players on both sides of the ball. I would say BYU isn't as complete of a team as they were last year, but at the same time, they still are. You just have different elements that factor into that, namely Bear Bachmeier at quarterback, true freshman. What does his introduction to the rivalry mean? Utah's traditionally done really well against true freshman quarterbacks, but does that still matter in a game like this? We'll see. Bachmeier has been a little bit more turnover prone the last couple games, which obviously is not a good thing for BYU going into this game. But that's not to say that he can't beat Utah, right? Just because he's a true freshman doesn't mean Utah has the clear advantage here. They also have LJ Martin. They have Chase Roberts. They have Parker Kingston, all of these guys that have been able to do really well for BYU. So it's going to be a tough battle. This will be a fun and entertaining game. I know many people that just want this week to be over with, and I don't blame you. There's a lot riding on this game. If Utah wins this game, there's a much clearer path to a Big 12 title game. You still got tough opponents, right? You still got, a Cincinnati, which is looking really solid. You still have to go to Kansas. Some of these other opponents can still trip you up, and you can't let this game kind of dictate how next week goes and the rest of the season unless you can build off of momentum. But this is a real turning point for both of these teams, right? You could still lose this game and get to the Big 12 title game for either one of these teams, but at the same time, this is going to be a big decider, knowing that BYU and Utah are at the top of the standings with Texas Tech, and able to compete with that. So really important game, two ranked teams, going to be a really fun environment. This is what college football is all about. If you can't get excited over this game, I don't know that you truly love college football. I understand you probably have a ton of nerves going into this game. That's just the nature of it, right? You can feel super confident as a Utah fan and go into this game, and then when kickoff happens, those nerves kick in, and there's a lot less confidence going into it just because you never know what's going to happen. So looking forward to this. We're gonna continue this preview by talking to a BYU beat writer, and we'll jump into that. So let's transition to that. But first, let me tell you about our partners at Canyon View Credit Union. At Canyon View Credit Union, it's on the house. Close a mortgage and get a free appraisal up to $600. To learn more details or apply, visit canyonviewcu.com. All right, joining me today is a fellow KSL.com writer. His name is Sean Walker. He's been covering BYU for as long as I can remember. No, he's been here for a hot minute. And, we're going to talk about this BYU-Utah game. So, Sean, welcome to the podcast, and let's get this thing rolling. Are you ready for this?
Josh, I'm excited to be here to break down all 13 tracks from Taylor Swift's Life of a Showgirl. Underrated on that album? Actually, I don't know if it's underrated anymore, but Opalite's definitely number one, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's got a definite vibe to it, right? I feel myself listening to a couple other songs, though. They've got a little bit of bop, like Wish List, Honey. You got to have some low-key tracks in there. What track embodies? Wow, that was quite the word. Embodies BYU or this rivalry.
Embodify, I believe, is a word that was used by Ariana Grande in the most recent production of Wicked.
Well, there we go. That also
I think
a good
she
one.
said embodify at least once or two. Let's see. I think this BYU-Utah rivalry is probably best summed up with the classic. Oh, it's 100%. It's actually romantic.
Okay, that's actually really good.
It is
That's
because
really
it's
good.
actually sweet. All this time you spend on me.
You talk about it, and it's just like your little dog. That's how much I think about you type mentality.
Yeah, I won't get into which team is playing the role of Blake Lively, but I think the Holy War is secretly actually romantic. I think that's probably the way to go.
So who's Taylor Swift and who's Charlie XCX? We're not going to do this.
No, we won't continue down that path.
All right, fine. We'll talk about actual football. So, Sean,
97th all-time meeting of BYU, the BYU-Utah rivalry, a rivalry that started in like 1922, I think is the official number.
That
Right?
also
That
didn't
number's
have
not
any
disputed
problems.
anyway.
No, it's not 103rd or whatever it is either. But to each their own.
You know it's a rivalry, Josh, and actually I think we can start there a little bit because it's a rivalry when the two teams can't even agree on the number of times that they've played.
Which is phenomenal. I mean, like the fact that you can't even get a basic baseline on that kind of shows the frustrations between these two teams.
Yeah. And I fully understand why. I've actually poked around about this a little bit, and maybe I'll put on like some capital J journalism here for the
would you do
podcast because
that?
I have
Why?
poked around some about why that number is so disputed. Utah says it's this will be the 103rd meeting. BYU says this will be the 97th meeting. Utah goes all the way back to I think 1896, I believe was their alleged first meeting. BYU's was in 1922. BYU actually doesn't count anything pre-1922 in terms of them being like a Division I football program. Because prior to that, their only football teams prior to that played under the Brigham Young Academy days, which they say shouldn't count because Brigham Young Academy had like an interesting educational relationship, I think, both with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the state of Utah, maybe even going back to the territory of Deseret, whatever it was. But they fielded, so they didn't just have like college students, university students on campus. They had some high school students on campus. And so their argument, what they say is those early BYA football teams, some of them fielded high school students. And so they don't kind of count them, I guess, like within the rivalry. Now, Utah obviously calls BS on that in a lot of ways. They say, no, there were 6 other meetings. The two teams split them 3-3. So it's not like it does anything winning percentage wise either. It's just it's 6 more games that Utah says existed. And BYU's like, well, actually, we were kind of sort of a high school at the time. So like, not really.
To be fair, though, most of these teams in those early days were playing like YMCA teams or some of these other teams.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, like these records are fraught with interest. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think some of the Brigham Young Academy teams also contain like overall records against like Granite High School. And there was literally a Salt Lake Y, the YMCA of Salt Lake that they did play at one point. Yeah, I mean, early college football is wild. We could write an entire book on just what college football looked like around the turn of the 20th century. It's probably not fair, and it's probably way too boring for the purposes of this podcast. But yeah, it's some of that early stuff was incredible.
Exactly. But now we don't have to worry about that. We're in the present. BYU comes into this game. They're 6-0. Similar record to what they were last year. Obviously, successful seasons. First time ever in BYU history that they've gone 6-0 in back-to-back seasons. With that said, what would you say is the general vibe of this team right now as opposed to maybe last year, where BYU was maybe a little bit more of an upstart team? People were just barely starting to kind of figure BYU out and saying, like, hey, this team might actually be good. This year, now, a year removed, clearly that, stellar season, 10-2, in the regular season, and then coming into this year of being able to have that kind of as the background. Where is this BYU team at right now?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to say that this year's 6-0 start is less of a surprise than last year's, just simply by the nature that this is a coaching staff that under Kalani Sitake, offensive coordinator Aaron Roderick, defensive coordinator Jay Hill, they stuck together. They kept they kind of brought the entire band back together. They brought back a lot of experience on the roster with guys like LJ Marin, Chase Roberts, Isaiah Judd on the offensive line, Jack Kelly, Isaiah Glasgow on defense, etc. So you would think that there was a lot of sort of continuity to where this year's 6-0 start isn't as much of a surprise. But I actually kind of think it's just as surprising, certainly from the eyes of the national media, but maybe even internally with some of the fan base as well, because of the turmoil this team faced in the offseason. And we don't need to rehash it. It's all over KSL.com and everything. We talked about it some in the offseason and everything, but having to replace quarterback Jake Retzloff the way they did so late in the season after spring practices, Jake goes through some of his issues through April and May, and even a little bit into June, winds up transferring to Tulane where he's starting over there. Actually looks like he's got the green wave as a contender in the American, which is wild for how late he got over there. BYU brings in the quarterback that turned out to be his replacement in true freshman Barrett Bogmeyer, who went through all of spring ball at Stanford, didn't get to Provo until like the last days of May, and somehow got in. And within 2 months, he got accustomed to his teammates. He met all the coaches. He learned the entire playbook. He picked up A-Rod's offensive scheme, which is not simple by any means. And like, I'm not pretending like he's a master of every play, like he became a master of every play, but he learned enough to earn the starting job right there. And to bring BYU to a 6-0 start under those circumstances, I'm sure there are some BYU fans out there, like blue goggle, dyed in the wool, true blue BYU fans that expected this just because of everything that they brought back. But I think if you true serum a lot of plenty of even BYU fans, they would say they're very pleasantly surprised with how this team has started. I think, and maybe we can transition here with this a little bit. I think part of the 6-0 start is the schedule that they had in front of them. The front half of the schedule is certainly softer than the back half of the schedule. It's about to get real and real fast, I like to say, with this BYU team. But considering where they started, I mean, literally only 4 or 5 months ago at this point, I think it's pretty remarkable that they are where they are. They've already extended the season. They've clinched bowl eligibility and the like. And to do it with a true freshman quarterback, I think is pretty impressive.
Yeah, and that is a good transition to that, where this schedule was always going to be a tale of two seasons, right? Like, you had the first half of the season where on paper you could say that BYU could easily get to 6-0. Now it's not an easy path to get to 6-0, right? Like, I think there was tough games. Clearly Colorado, clearly Arizona. They had to grit it out and be able to get those wins, and you're doing that with the true freshman QB. But at the same time, it was kind of baked in that could be a realistic possibility. Now, this latter half, this becomes the game where everything kind of changes, right? BYU obviously has some great momentum. They're 6-0. They've got 2 wins in this rivalry streak after Utah went 9-0. This becomes a great jumping off point for BYU. And I think, both of these teams have their own respective things where this game can kind of serve as a point. But looking from the BYU perspective, how important of a win would this be to be able to help jumpstart BYU to actually show that they really have a legit shot at a Big 12 title?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely massive. Like, not to look ahead, because this is a rivalry game. You never look ahead in a rivalry game. I really don't think anybody on that Provo campus is looking past this game. I don't think anybody in Salt Lake is looking past this game either. Quite frankly, that's what the rivalry is. But for BYU, after this game, you go to Iowa State, to Texas Tech, you're home to TCU, you're at Cincinnati, and then you wrap up with a home game against UCF. Like, that's very different than starting with Portland State and Stanford, a team that might be the worst FCS team in the country and a team that's probably the worst or one of the worst power conference teams in the country right there. Like, it's just, they're so diametrically opposed in a lot of ways. I don't like making a lot of predictions or a lot of projections, but I don't think it's too much to say that expecting 6-0 out of the back half of BYU schedule is not nearly as easy as 6-0 out of the front half of BYU schedule. They're probably going to drop some games. There's probably some losses on here. There might be a loss this weekend against Utah. I mean, they are 3-point underdogs. Last time I checked it at time of recording. But if they can get off to a start and prove that they can beat a quality ranked opponent like Utah, then all of a sudden they're set up much better for that trip to Iowa State and that trip to Texas Tech in particular. But I really think this BYU season is defined by these, I'll even throw in TCU at home, by these next 4 games. Mm-hmm. This is where we learn if BYU is simply a nice story, a good story, a solid rebound story based off of where they were, or if they are, I mean, obviously truly a contender in the Big 12, but also a contender nationally for maybe a college football playoff berth or that kind of thing. Like, these next 4 games will tell you everything that you really need to know about this BYU team.
Let's jump into the game a bit. Yesterday, so Wednesday night, the first availability report came in, and I don't think it was really that shocking for anybody that follows these programs. Obviously, Isaiah Glasker played last week, and so that was not a surprise that he'd play again. But the biggest news, I would say, is probably Jack Kelly is off of the injury report and is expected to play. I think we all kind of expected that to trend that way. Whether he's 100% healthy or not, this was the game that you just don't miss, right? And as long as it's not putting him into an additional health problem, he was going to play, right? He's a big factor, an element of that defensive unit. Where does BYU stand with that? And we can talk in a second about Raider Damuni's impact, but where did these two in particular stand? What's their health status? Obviously, being off the depth or the injury report, where are they right now, and what does that mean for BYU in this defense?
Yeah, Jay Hill actually kind of tipped Jack Kelly's status a little bit before the official availability report came out. So I don't think there was any surprise that he wasn't listed on that availability report. What he did tell us after practice on Wednesday was that Jack is feeling, and I thought it interesting, he used the word that he's feeling a lot better than he did last week. He got hurt against West Virginia. It looked like some sort of a shoulder, upper arm, upper body injury in there. I don't want to diagnose too much because I'm not a medical doctor, contrary to popular belief.
You play one on TV though, right?
But he came out of that game against West Virginia, didn't finish it, and then he had sort of a questionable to semi-doubtful status that entire week of the Arizona game. Ended up being a game-time decision. And then at the last minute, they pulled him. They didn't play him. And BYU survives that game in double overtime. I think a big reason why that game went to double overtime was because of the absence of Jack Kelly. But it was very clear that if there's any questionable status with a player of his magnitude, arguably BYU's best defensive player, likely NFL draft pick, he probably could have been drafted in the NFL if he had left after last year, but he came back for one more season, tried to make a run with his guys at BYU. And I think if there was any doubt of, well, maybe you can play against Arizona and maybe it limits you or inhibits you in any way against that rivalry game, it was very clear that this rivalry game was more important to this BYU team, maybe to Jack himself. I'm sure he wanted to play. He wants to play every game probably, but if you probably ask him, if you really true serve him and say, would you rather play on the road in Tucson or would you rather play at home in front of your home fans against your in-state rival, he'd probably tell you Utah's that more important game. And again, this is conjecture. This is speculation. That's what we do here. This is Sports Talk Radio essentially. But it seems like that was kind of the decision was, do you take a chance against Arizona or do you make sure to have this guy back and fully ready to go against Utah? He's very clearly fully ready. He's not even on the injury report in the least, but he's been practicing full go for the last several days. There are a couple of other guys that we'll get into that aren't in that situation, but I'm expecting basically no restrictions from Jack Kelly when he lines up against the Utes on Saturday night.
Let's jump into Raider Damuni, obviously a vital piece to that defense as well. There's obviously, running back depth that has been a bit thin for BYU, and I want to talk about LJ Martin here in a minute, but you don't have a lot of depth in there. You've got also Raider Damuni out. I mean, what's kind of that status, and how does that impact this BYU team?
Yeah, it's pretty big. Starting strong safety for most of the season. He's part of a secondary that's among the best in the country in terms of takeaways, in terms of lockdown. He's one of, I'm trying to do the math real quick, 6 guys, I think, on this BYU defense with interceptions. Like Raider Damuni's a big loss, I think, for BYU. He came out in the first half of that Arizona game with what looked like some sort of a core / abdominal / rib injury somewhere in that core section. And I think it's a big one. I think it's slightly mitigated by the fact that I mentioned Raider Damuni is a starting strong safety. Falatal Satuala has been right there as kind of a co-starter, sort of a rotating safety, 3 safeties for 2 positions, if you will, between Satuala, Damuni, and Tanner Wall, the starting free safety back there. So I think that's probably the easiest sort of like for like that you can make with BYU. Like, you don't want to lose a guy like Raider, the experience that he is. But Faletau Satuala has been coming on really well in the last couple of weeks. He's quietly been one of BYU's best defensive players, according to Pro Football Focus and PFF College. I think last week against Arizona, I believe he graded out as their top defensive player, as their number one defensive player by PFF. He was either number one or number two off the top of my head. And so, like, a loss of somebody like Raider Damuni, like, it's not good. It's never good. It certainly impacts your depth, but I think it's maybe a little bit more manageable and a little bit more sustainable because of the way Satuala's been playing, certainly for the last couple of weeks, and in particular last week on the road at Arizona.
Let's transition to Bear Bachmeier, obviously the true freshman quarterback. You mentioned him earlier, so this isn't a secret. Everybody knows who this guy is, and I think you can look at this season as being very successful already for him, right? I mean, it's not easy for a true freshman to come in and have a stellar season. You know, looking at what Utah did last year with Isaac Wilson, I had to do a lot of research on what a true freshman's kind of standard season is as a true freshman, and for the most part it just doesn't bode well for these guys. Like, they're just not easy. That doesn't mean that they can't have individual successes, but it's not easy. Now, Bear has been able to show out and be able to have a great opportunity. Maybe some of that's a little bit of the schedule of them being able to kind of ramp him up, and I think that's probably been the best opportunity for BYU Utah. But how would you say Bear has come along? Because clearly the last 2 weeks, there's been a few more freshman mistakes, but he's still producing at a high level. Where's he at, and what BYU hopes is his progression, and how is Aaron Roderick kind of unlocking some potential with him?
Yeah, and he's kind of doing it by degrees in a lot of ways, because I say he jumped right in and he learned the playbook. Again, like, I don't think Bear immediately, like, unlocked 110% of that playbook. I don't think he was connecting at, like, every single level, like on this super deep, like, even maybe intellectual level in some ways. But he's a really smart player. He graduated early and got into Stanford initially. That's where he signed. That's where he enrolled. He was on track to potentially be the starter there before they fired Troy Taylor and kind of sent his career in a different direction in a lot of ways. And I bring that up only not only to say, like, what Stanford is and where they are and kind of where their football program is, but just the fact that academically he was there on that level at a place like a Stanford tells you just how intelligent, mentally, emotionally, physically mature in a lot of ways Bear Bachmeier really is. Like, he's Kalani said it last week after the Arizona game, where he said, you know, it's 6 games in, 6 starts in, 6-0 into his freshman campaign. It's probably time we maybe stop referring to Bear Bachmeier as a true freshman. Like, that doesn't mean he's not going to be a freshman the rest of the year. That doesn't mean he's incapable of making freshman mistakes. That's still entirely possible, but he's not playing like a true freshman at the very least. He's got a lot of time, a lot of experience. He's got, you know, sort of too many seasons under his belt, if you count the first half of this year and then that spring campaign as well. Something I thought was really interesting that yeah, you're right, Josh. Like, it's not normal for a true freshman to come in and do some of the stuff that Bear Bachmeier is doing, short of having like a Trevor Lawrence type talent. What he was able to do from the get-go at Clemson. And, you know, you see national guys maybe jump up like that all of the time, but it's easy, even with some of those big national stories, for these freshmen or first-time starters to fall off. Like, look no further than one Manning, Arch over at Texas and what he's doing. Bryce Underwood is even struggling some at Michigan. Like freshmen and first-time starters, just they have issues. What Bear's able to do is he's able to rebound and sometimes even mask a lot of his deficiencies, where the last couple of weeks he's thrown 3 interceptions total, and every single time he's responded to those interceptions by going right back out on the next drive and leading a touchdown or a scoring drive in one way or another. Like, you don't necessarily expect perfection from these young players, but if they can rebound from their imperfections, I think that's about as good as you can ask for. If you want a number that I think is really important, 90 total points is the number that Bear Bachmeier has accounted for in his first 6 collegiate starts. That's both with his feet and his arm. He's a true dual threat quarterback. That ranks number 30 nationally in terms of scoring by a non-kicker, by an actual field player. So he's a top 30 quarterback in terms of scoring. Again, he's not perfect. He's thrown a couple of picks. He no longer has that X number of passes that he's thrown without an interception. I think he started 4 games without a pick, that kind of thing. So he's not perfect in any way, in any ways, but he's been very good, and he's been able to bounce back from these imperfections, which I think speaks as much to his character as anything else.
Bear has obviously been one of the biggest assets for that offense, and for good reason, right? Quarterback is always going to get that. But a guy that, he's not being underlooked by any means. Like, people definitely recognize who he is, but that's LJ Martin. Every single year that he's been at BYU, he's continually ramped up, and this year he's having a phenomenal season. One of the best running backs in the Big 12 in the country. I mean, he's done exactly what you want him to do. What has allowed LJ to kind of be where he is today, and how does this offense change if a team like Utah can stop the run?
Yeah, if you ask LJ and any of his coaches, it's health. He's been able to stay healthy for the first 6 games of his career. He's fully healthy for the first 6 games of his career for the first time since the freshman out of El Paso stepped foot in Provo 3 years ago. 4 of his 6 games so far, he's topped the century mark. That included a career high 162 last week against Arizona. He's scoring touchdowns. He's finding the end zone. He's doing everything that Aaron Roderick and running backs coach Harvey Unga want him to do. And maybe most importantly, both of those guys will point out, is he's a much better blocker than he was his first 2 years. He's able to stay on the field even when he doesn't get the ball, being kind of that lead blocker for Bachmeier. He's able to get downfield and kind of open up and take on some extra blocking responsibilities in the passing game. He's doing a lot of those little things that maybe don't get tracked on the stat sheet, that a lot of fans maybe don't notice, but he's doing a lot of those little things to just prove that he can be an every down type of player. And I don't say every down as in like BYU's running it through him every down, although they're coming pretty close. He touched the ball 25 times, I think, against Arizona, right? He's getting a ton of carries and a very heavy workload. But even when they're not specifically going to him, they can't really keep him off of the field because of those other things that he's able to do in the blocking game and in the downfield game that I think is just as important as what he's doing rushing-wise, which, by the way, is also really good. He's around 600 yards. He's close to 600 yards through 6 games, which is pretty close to all you can ask out of your lead tailback.
Over the offseason, there was a lot of drama with some of the Utah players that transferred to BYU. Obviously, one of them being the highest, and I don't want to relitigate all this stuff. I don't really care. But you do have a guy in Carson Ryan who comes in as a tight end, clearly didn't have the production that he was hoping for at Utah. There's a lot of reasons why for that, but there was clearly talent there. You also have Keanu Tenavasa, who was a starting defensive tackle for Utah, transfers to BYU. A lot of drama filled with that one. These two have been kind of different players for BYU. Carson Ryan, I would say, has probably unlocked a lot of his potential there, and he's done really well and been great for BYU that over the last few years, quite honestly, just hasn't done a ton with the tight end position, and he's really been effective there. Keanu, has been a little bit more absent, I would say, and fans, you can see a little frustrated. That happens, right? Like, not every game is going to be perfect for a defensive tackle. Where are these two players right now, and how have they kind of impacted this BYU team?
I think Carson's probably one of the biggest breakout stars of this offense, just because they didn't really know what they had when he transferred from Utah to BYU. 14 catches for 211 yards, 2 touchdowns. That probably doesn't say everything that doesn't fully annotate the impact of where he's been on this BYU offense. Aaron Roderick calls him the most complete tight end that they've had since Isaac Rex. And he's, knock on wood so far, right? But so far he's stayed healthier than Isaac Rex did in the latter stages of his career. He's a guy who can He's their top blocking tight end and also their top receiving tight end. They'll put him on the field in two tight end formations just as an extra blocker. Like they can't keep him off of the field in a lot of ways, which for a fifth-year senior I think is really important. He's that impactful both in the blocking game as he is in the receiving game, and I think BYU just hasn't had sort of that combo for several years. They've had really good receiving tight ends, and they've had really good blocking tight ends. And it's been a minute, probably since at least Isaac Rex, since they had a guy who could really, get you a guy who can do both, right? Get you a girl who can do both, as the old saying goes. Like he is that guy who can do both, and in terms of both blocking and receiving. Keanu Tanavasa, I think, is a little bit different because there has been some talk about quote unquote disappointments through the first 6 games of the season. And I understand some of that maybe coming off of that Arizona game where he missed the entire second half due to a targeting penalty. He's been penalty ridden for a couple of games now since the West Virginia game. Even he's had just a couple of weird penalties, weird fouls, stuff that he himself says he needs to clean up. So I don't need to throw too much dirt on that. But I think you saw the impact of him on that BYU defense by what they looked like in the second half against Arizona. Defensive tackles don't get a ton of credit for a lot of things that they do. They're not always the leading tackler on a team. They don't constantly get to the quarterback. Their job is to open up the offensive line to eat up space inside against that offensive line so that your edge rushers, your defensive ends, your edge rushers, your pass rushers, your Jack Kellys, per se, for example, can get to the quarterback and can cause some disruption. BYU didn't really have that space eater in the second half against Arizona, and I think it sort of took Keanu Tanavasa coming out to realize exactly what he was doing in the middle of the field for a lot of fans. So, again, I'm not saying he's been perfect. I'm not even saying that he handled his transfer away from the U perfectly. There were plenty of mistakes that he made, both just in terms of communication and explaining himself, and he probably tried. He mentioned this to us during media days back in Frisco in July. He said he probably tried to kind of explain maybe a little bit too much about his transfer, when the reality is, at the end of the day, when you're talking about moving on to a rival, like, nothing that you say is going to fully defend that move. There are going to be people that support you. There are going to be people that hate you. And it's really hard to kind of shift anybody from one side to the other. So he hasn't been perfect both on the field and off the field, but I think he's been really important for a BYU team that lost every starter on its defensive line from a year ago. And he's just that big 300-pounder in the middle that eats up a ton of space, takes up a ton of tackles, some of those double teams, sometimes even, triple teams, 2.5 teams, whatever. And you really saw just sort of the impact of that last week in the second half in Tucson.
My favorite part of that is nobody is looking at the box score for what a defensive tackle does. Most of the time, a defensive tackle, as long as they're not committing penalties or doing different things, they're those types of players where as long as you don't hear their name, you're fine, right? That means they've probably be performing their job or whatever that may be. But I think with just the high nature of kind of how he announced himself coming to BYU and then trying to explain it away and everything, it just brought some undue criticism for himself just because of that. And so there's been a lot more attention on him where, like you said, I think when you see him off the field, there's clearly an impact, right? Are there things that he needs to clean up? Sure. But that's every defensive tackle, right? Like outside of some elite ones out there, that's just kind of the nature of the game because it's a tough position. It's tough to be able to be in the trenches and to be able to win your one-on-ones because it's just the nature. It's a gritty position. And so it's just kind of funny that there is this attention to him because had this not played out this way, I don't know that you pay attention to Keanu Tanavasa, right? Like, I don't know that this is something that you look at and you say, oh yeah, like he's not performing well, because nobody's paying attention to that. It's like the offensive line. Most people aren't paying attention to the offensive line and understanding with, clear understanding of what it takes to be able to play that position.
Yeah, linemen are both on both sides of the trenches. Linemen are probably the most under respected position in the entire game, because you never really notice them until they actually screw up, until they commit a penalty and that kind of thing. The less you're talking about them, most of the time, the better. There are some exceptions, and I know, media is getting a little bit more advanced, where there are people that are noticing the offensive line or the defensive line. And if you ask a defensive-minded coach, which both of these programs are led by very defensive-minded coaches, Kyle Whittingham and Kalani Sitake, they'll tell you that a good interior D lineman, a good nose tackle, a good defensive tackle is kind of the basis of your entire system. Like, that is the foundation that you kind of build your entire system on. And if you take away that foundation, everything else just sort of starts to implode around it. You need sort of that pillar in the middle, that 300-pounder in the middle, to say, hey, I'm not going to give up my ground. I'm not going to move my ground. In order for all of the other pieces to work. Kalani likes to talk about everybody, especially defensively, doing their 111th and not doing more than their 111th. And I don't think anybody's 11th is necessarily bigger than the next person, but I think you'd be harder to find a more foundational 11th than that interior defensive lineman on the defensive side of the ball.
Absolutely agree. All right, last question for you before we get you out. I don't like to ask for predictions for my guests. I don't think that's as fun. So I'm going to ask you a different side of that, even though it's kind of a prediction. Let's be real. How does BYU lose this game?
I think win or lose for both sides. Like, this is a rivalry series that, if you were to take one thing away from this game, take this to Vegas, bet the mortgage. Actually, don't bet the mortgage.
Don't bet the mortgage on this game, please.
Because that would be a really, really bad idea.
Yes.
But the most likely outcome of this game is a one possession game. I think it's something like 13 of the last 15 games have been decided by a score or less. Like, this is always a single digit game. This is always one possession more often than not. Even when one team gets out to a big lead, I'm thinking of like that 2015 Las Vegas Bowl. One team gets out to a big lead, it still winds up being a one possession game in one way or another. So that being said, in one possession games, the biggest differentiator between teams is turnovers. If you win the turnover battle, more often than not, you come out ahead in these types of games, because they are so tightly contested. BYU for the last two games has lost the turnover battle. And that's something that's a little bit concerning. Like, Aaron Roderick even brought it up the other day when we were talking to him after practice. Like, it's one game against West Virginia, you could probably explain away, jitters, freshman mistakes, whatever it is. Back-to-back games, it's a little bit concerning when you're giving the ball away and your defense isn't forcing more turnovers than what you're able to give it away. So I think that's probably the number one stat that I'll point to. And I think it applies to both BYU and Utah equally, is that turnover battle. How do both Devin Dampier for Utah and Bear Bachmeier for BYU, respectively, how do they manage their own the turnovers on the offensive side of the ball? And then what can the defense do in terms of taking away the football from the other offense? I think that's where this game is won. It's really easy to spout cliches like the game is won in the trenches or stopping the run or that kind of thing. I think those things can be true, but I think turnovers are number one. It's who takes care of the football the best, and then what defense is able to best capitalize off of their own turnovers or their own takeaways as well.
And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that the last 2 years, the 2 years that BYU has won, they haven't committed a turnover, and Utah has. And so I think you're absolutely spot on that this becomes a major component of the game. So, all right, Sean, appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Let everybody know where they can find you if they want to follow you for BYU stuff or to have that takes and kind of what you're working on.
Yeah, check it out at Rock and Royal Pod on YouTube. That's where I just kind of dump everything after practices, after games. There's some analysis. We talk more than just football over there. Basketball season starting. I've even got a part-time contributor doing some women's soccer coverage for Jen Rockwood's program on that side. It's also on Instagram at Rock and Royal Pod as well. If they want to give that a shout, give that a follow.
Awesome. Thank you so much, man. All right, we thank Sean for coming on the podcast and talking about BYU. As has been mentioned, this is going to be a tight game, or at least it's expected to be a tight game. It should be a fun environment. It should be a great opportunity to be able to see two competitive teams that are just at the top of their game right now, and that's what you want in this rivalry. You want to be able to have two top dogs going after each other and trying to see who can get the edge and take that next step to being able to be at the top of the Big 12 food chain. So really looking forward to this game. Obviously, it'll be a lot of fun. If you're going to the game, stay safe. Be respectful, I'll say, to the opponent. It's always better that way. We don't need people getting in fights or anything that way. You can still hate each other, right? Like you can still hate that and do that and banter. But let's keep it civil a little bit and have some fun. It's a great opportunity to be able to see two competitive teams and it happens in your backyard. So with that, we'll sign out and we'll come back next week and see how this all shook out. So with that, we'll sign off. Have a great weekend and good luck to whichever team you're rooting for.